The door opened to reveal two surprise endorsements. The bosses of the TUC and the CBI, both in Downing Street, to give public backing to the Chancellor's package. Some bosses and unions wondered if that was entirely wise, whether Rishi Sunak's new job creation scheme could save many jobs as he prepares to shut down the giant £40 billion furlough scheme.
It is now clear, as the Prime Minister and our scientific advisers have said, for at least the next 6 months, the virus and restrictions are going to be a fact of our lives. Our economy is now likely to undergo a more permanent adjustment. The sources of our economic growth and the kinds of jobs we create will adapt and evolve to the new normal. And our plan needs to adapt and evolve in response.
Under the Job Support Scheme, someone whose hours have been cut to a third of their normal hours could get a subsidy. So, if you're on £350 a week and your hours go down to a third the normal ones, you'd expect your salary to go down to about a third of the normal wage. Under this scheme, the government will chip in some money to make it go up and require the employer to chip in some money to put it up some more. You'll be close to, but not at, your original salary. The problem is the employer is now paying per hour more than they were before. Some think that'll be a disincentive for employers to join the scheme. There could be a £1,000 bonus if you hold on to an employee by the end of January. But is that enough?
The government will directly support the wages of people in work, giving businesses who face depressed demand the option of keeping employees in a job on shorter hours rather than making them redundant.
There are some serious design flaws in the schemes he set out today, in particular because employers will be required to pay a very large, 1/3 of the wage costs for the period when workers are not working. They won't have a very strong incentive to use this scheme to keep workers on part-time and make sure those workers' pay is topped up by the government.
Much of the hospitality industry has reopened since lockdown, but the early closing laws taking effect tonight unnerve many employers, wondering what other restrictions are still to come.
They're going to be required to give an upfront commitment that they're not making any redundancies in order to be able to benefit from this scheme. And that's something that they just can't predict at the moment. So if you're faced, as many of them are, with closing down your premises because you've lost your trade, or not being able to reopen big chunks of your activity, events, functions, Christmas lunches, you're just going to press the button on those redundancies now.
Labour said employers needed to know what was replacing the furlough scheme earlier, and this landlord from just outside Nottingham agreed.
Unfortunately, it is just a little bit too late. I think if this had been planned with more time and it had been done maybe 6 weeks ago, the country wouldn't be staring at a lot of redundancies that are now on the cards. Personally, we could have probably kept another 15 staff or so that unfortunately we had to let go in the last round of retention.
The Chancellor also announced government support for the self-employed continues, but they can now only claim 20% of monthly profits, down from 70 to 80% before. 4 loan schemes, which have already backed £58 billion in lending, are extended to the end of November. VAT already reduced from 20 to 5% for restaurants, hotels and cinemas will stay at that lower rate until the end of March.
I cannot save every business. I cannot save every job. It is fundamentally wrong to hold people in jobs that only exist inside the furlough. We need to create new opportunities and allow the economy to move forward. And that means supporting people to be in viable jobs which provide genuine security.
He didn't spell out which jobs might not be viable anymore, nor how he would raise money to pay for the costs of COVID. One report today estimated they were already well over £300 billion.
So the Chancellor says his new plan will help to save jobs. Our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is outside number 11 Downing Street. Helia, will this stave off mass unemployment?
I think, John, that's the key question. When you talk to economists today, they're still talking about a wall of unemployment that's going to go up from 4 to 8% by the end of the year. Now, that's a big shock to the system after a decade of almost full employment. And today's tinkering doesn't really change many of those forecasts.
So why won't today's measures make that much difference then?
I think if you look at the furlough scheme, there's maybe 2-3 million people still on the furlough scheme in hospitality, in the arts, in retail. Many of those jobs are low skilled and low paid. And as Gary was saying, now companies are being asked not only to pay for hours worked, but hours not worked. Now that might seem quite expensive. This rescue package could be more useful in the next 6 months when we're expecting to see the economy slow. New jobs could be at risk, jobs in construction, jobs in manufacturing, high-skilled jobs. Maybe businesses will be minded to pay more for those types of jobs. Now, as Gary was talking about, that question of viability, which jobs are, which jobs aren't, I pressed the Chancellor on that earlier today. Do you think jobs like those, where trading has fallen off completely, are those jobs still viable?
I can't promise that everyone can go back to the job that they used to have. We obviously can't sustain the same level of things that we were doing at the beginning of this crisis, but nor would it right to do so either, because the situation has evolved.
I think you have to remember the scale of economic fiscal stimulus that we've seen this year and how small today's piece actually is. Now, we don't have the exact numbers, we don't even have a budget, but we do think that the job support scheme will cost the government three and a bit billion pounds for the whole 6-month duration. To give you some context, Job, the furlough scheme cost £4 billion for 1 month alone. And to give you even more context, we're heading for a deficit this year because of all the intervention that we've seen of £370 billion.
Helia Ebrahimi outside the Chancellor's residence there in 11 Downing Street.
Noel, earlier I spoke to Labour's Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, and began by asking whether she appreciates the Chancellor's honesty in saying he can't protect every job.
Well, I appreciate the fact that we are obviously in this tremendous national crisis, very sadly, and it's having a very severe economic impact. I think what's really important now, however, is to acknowledge that the UK, just as we appear to have the worst excess death rate in Europe, seem to be experiencing the deepest recession in the G7 and quite a slow recovery, unfortunately. So it's really important the Chancellor does all that he can to recover jobs, retrain workers and rebuild businesses. And I'm afraid this morning we didn't get enough to achieve those goals.
Well, Mr Sunak says that he's launched a radical new policy to protect as many jobs as possible, given that we are facing an unprecedented situation.
So I called on the Chancellor 40 times to advance a wage support scheme. Obviously, I'm pleased that he has finally listened. It wasn't just Labour calling for that, also businesses and trade unions. But now that we've seen more details of that scheme, I am concerned that it may not do enough to incentivise the number of employers that we need to take on and keep on more employees. That's really the litmus test of this proposal that he's put forward, whether it really will lead to more employees being kept on.
So what would you do differently if you had the keys to number 11? Because the Chancellor accuses you of constantly changing your position.
Yeah, I find that very, very peculiar coming from the Chancellor, and in fact he knows full well that I have asked him 40 times to adopt a system of wage support. It's there in black and white. I'm surprised that he's confused around that, and his government rejected that call 20 times.
But if you're calling for further action, at some point we will have to think about how that's paid for. Would you support tax rises then?
Well, of course we will need to look very carefully at how this will be paid for. Right now we are experiencing a low interest rate environment at the same time as the steepest recession in 300 years. So what the Chancellor must be focused on is preserving economic capacity. That's incredibly important. We can have discussions in a hypothetical way about the tax system, but if the tax base is shrinking, as it has been recently with people losing their jobs, less consumer spending and businesses going to the wall, then ultimately that's a hypothetical question. The government needs right now to be focused on jobs.
Annalise Dodds, thank you very much for joining us. Well, I'm joined now by Ray NewtonSmith, who's Chief Economist at the Confederation of British Industry. Ray NewtonSmith, welcome to the programme. Your boss stood next to the Chancellor outside Number 11. That's quite the endorsement of this government scheme.
Yes, look, I think businesses will be breathing a sigh of relief today. No, that we may still need to see more, but I think what we've seen announced today is something that businesses and the TUC and others have been calling for, is a work support scheme that will save jobs that have a future, which will help to support businesses through what we know is going to be really tough times over the next few months. And it will really help at this time when demand is still weak, while we look to the recovery get on a much more solid footing. And I think he also announced a whole set of measures to give businesses more breathing space with the pressures on their cash flow.
Sorry to interrupt you. What do you think about this idea of viable versus non-viable jobs? Because there are going to be a lot of redundancies coming as a result.
Look, I think, as the Chancellor said, we cannot save every single business and every single job. And I think keeping the furlough scheme running in its current form wasn't affordable over the long term. And I think it's really important that we do move to a position where we are supporting people in work, keeping that connection with the workplace, keeping on building skills and retraining. And this work support scheme does allow, it means that people will be working at least a third of their normal working hours. They can use the other time to really focus on retraining, and both the government employees and employers will be contributing to those non-worked hours.
We haven't heard any package of retraining measures though, have we?
So there's obviously other measures out there. And I think some of these absolutely do need to be worked on. That's something we are committed to. I know the TUC are also committed to. But I wouldn't underestimate the support that this has given to, I've been speaking to a regional airport and they've said this has really made a difference to some of the job losses they were looking at, from manufacturers, and many other businesses besides. It won't save every job. Very quickly,
though, there are millions of people who won't get any support. If you work in the theatre or arts or sport, you might not be able to work a third of your hours. What would you say to those people tonight?
Look, we may need to see more targeted action in the future. I don't think we've seen the end of the Chancellor moving in to support the economy. But also he has done a bunch of measures to ensure that the loan schemes will be open till the end of the year, and the repayments on that will be spread over a much longer period of time. All of this, businesses breathing space to help us get to the other side so we can have the economy on a much more solid footing.
Ray NewtonSmith, thank you very much for joining us.